I'm going to do some reading that's a little bit more simple before we're moving on to sensation and perception within the um, psychology section of our playlist. We're diving in today into a little bit of American history, the American Revolution. In particular, the War for Independence. This is our part two. Washington succeeded in New England, but a column for his camp in Cambridge and another force advancing up the Hudson River failed to wrest Canada from the crown. At the city of Quebec, they met defeat on the 31st of December, 1775, resulting in the death of General Richard Montgomery and the wounding of Colonel Benedict Arnold. In the spring of 1776, Washington and his army were on the move headed for New York City. Howe had evacuated Boston a few weeks earlier, choosing to regroup, await reinforcements from Britain, and then attack where the Americans seemed more vulnerable. Of course, reports had that he would soon assemble a huge force for an attack on New York. The British unfolded an ambitious plan for the campaign of 1776. General Howe and his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, rode at anchor before New York City in August. Their armada, huge by that day's standards, consisted of 73 warships and several hundred transports carrying 32,000 troops. Their objectives were to take New York City, that is, and then to isolate New England, which they considered to be the storm center of the rebellion. And in doing so, they sought to draw Washington into a full-scale battle, destroy his army, and bring about the collapse of resistance itself. It might all have worked. Between August and December, William Howe bested Washington in a series of contests in the greater New York City area. At Brooklyn Heights on Long Island, at Kips Bay and Harlem Heights on Manhattan Island, and at White Plains on the mainland. In defending the islands, Washington risked encirclement, but thanks in part to luck and House lethargy, he managed to extract most of his army. That the British captured about 2,000, however, and they pulled back into other positions. Initially, as he fled through New Jersey, Washington's situation seemed to go from bad to worse. Howe's advanced units were right on the heels of his army, as his small army unraveled from expired enlistments and desertions. And although Washington escaped into Pennsylvania, his departure allowed Howe to station garrisons throughout the Jerseys and to detach a force that seized Newport in Rhode Island. The campaign of 1776, however, did not end with the calendar. Washington bounced back with two brilliant assaults. Crossing back over the Delaware River to Trenton in New Jersey, on Christmas night, he picked off the celebrating German troops, the so-called Hessians. Returning briefly to Pennsylvania, Washington gathered militia support and again crossed into New Jersey. Outmaneuvering British reinforcements from New York, he captured Princeton, New Jersey, and gained the protection of the mountains near Morristown for the winter. Leaving garrisons in New York and Rhode Island, William Howe moved against Philadelphia, the Patriot capital. He decided to take his army by sea rather than by land. And not only longer this sea route meant that he and General John, in command of a smaller army in Canada, would remain in the dark about each other's location and intentions. It seems incredible that Lord George Germain, the British Colonel Secretary, and the man supervising military operations in America, authorized this campaign without insisting on coordination and cooperation between Howe and Burgoyne. But similar miscommunications and conflicts within the British command structure would be repeated throughout the war, with serious consequences as the result. Departing on the 23rd of July, 1777, Howe sailed down the coast and on the 25th of August landed at the head of Chesapeake Bay. Washington positioned his army across Howe's line of advance and confronted him on the 11th of September at Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania. In fierce fighting, Howe eventually turned Washington's right flank, and the Americans withdrew. Washington suffered 1,000 casualties in all categories, twice that of Howe, or the British, and could only watch as his adversary occupied Philadelphia. Then, before the dawn, on the 4th of October, Washington struck Germantown, where Howe had quartered part of his army. The contest was intense, with each side experiencing roughly the same number of casualties as they had at Brandywine. Howe knew that his triumphs were costly because he could not count on reinforcements, and Washington could. He settled in for the winter at Philadelphia, while Washington retired to Valley Forge, 22 miles northwest of the capital, to keep an eye on General Howe. Meanwhile, Burgoyne's 1777 campaign from Canada, aided by a diversionary movement of 2,000 troops under General Barry Ledger, moving east along the Mohawk Valley, started well. Burgoyne exuded confidence, but he had Lord George Germain. Lord George Germain failed to comprehend that the Americans would quickly increase their northern army, commanded by General Philip Schuyler, and later by General Horatio Gates. Burgoyne, with a force of 7,000 British regulars, Germans, Indians, and Tories, retained his optimism for the time being. According to the fascinating journal account of Baroness Frederica von Riedesel, wife of Brunswicker commander, Burgoyne partied along the way in scandalous fashion, fueled by wine and the charms of his mistress. Traveling up Lake Champlain in June, he placed heavy artillery above Fort Ticonderoga, forcing the Americans to evacuate the post. Facing minor opposition, he moved to Skenesborough, 25 miles from the Hudson River, where he rested for 3 weeks awaiting his supply wagons, slowed by upstate New York's rough forested terrain. The delay was a major error. It gave the Americans a chance to create obstructions and to reorganize and augment their northern army on the west side of the Hudson. Again, that's the Hudson River. And as Burgoyne had lurched forward, he was bedeviled by downed trees and flooded creeks designed to slow his pace. He needed 24 days to reach the Hudson, which he crossed only to encounter a revived and well-entrenched American Northern Army. That was not the end of the bad news. St. Ledger's expedition, half British and half Indian, had been turned back at Fort Stanwix and Oriskany, and Burgoyne and his eastern wing, a column searching for horses and foodstuffs, fell to Patriot militia in what became known as the Battle of Bennington. Burgoyne's choices were grim: turn around and struggle back through the North Country or fight his way through the Americans waiting on Bemis Heights. Always a gambler, he fought 2 bloody battles on the 19th of September and October the 7th, and suffered approximately 1,200 casualties, more than the American losses. Encircled and unaware that the British garrison in New York City could not extricate him, the Briton capitulated on the 17th of October at Saratoga. Burgoyne and Howe, by their failure to cooperate, had botched the campaign of 1777. In one respect, however, General Howe displayed superior judgment. He stayed near the coast, never venturing far from his supply lines, and very mindful of the fact, having served in America in the French and Indian War, that the wilderness could swallow up a British army. Gates's victory at Saratoga gave France the final nudge to becoming an overt American ally. Washington and his generals stressed to the lawmakers in Philadelphia that military aid from abroad was imperative because America lacked the know-how to manufacture large quantities of military stores. And in fact, Congress's resolution for independence included language calling for foreign alliances. And even before the month of July in 1776, Congress began sending representatives abroad. Led by Benjamin Franklin, they dealt skillfully with the French and gained the confidence of the normally cautious Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes. For over 2 years, French agents surreptitiously supply the Americans with arms and munitions. With the victory at Saratoga, France and America signed treaties of commerce and alliance in February of 1778, formally bringing the French into the war. It was an auspicious beginning to a year that marked a turning point in the war. And although they continued to hold New York and Newport, again, Newport's in Rhode Island, the British had little to show for 3 years of campaigning in New England and the Middle States. In the month of June in 1778, they evacuated Philadelphia and their forces returned overland to bolster the garrison in New York. General Washington, after the winter at Valley Forge, fielded a much better trained army. He trained to the British until he and Sir Henry Clinton, on the 28th of June, fought an indecisive battle at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey. Clinton, who had been the British second in command since 1776, succeeded William Howe, who had taken or had asked to be relieved and had returned to England, skeptical that Britain could ever turn the clock back and totally subdue America. We have quoted here from the Treaty of Alliance with France. He said, if war should break out between France and Great Britain during the continuance of the present war between the United States and England, His Majesty and the said United States shall make it a common cause, and aid each other mutually with their good offices, their counsels, and their forces, according to the exigence of conjecture, as becomes good and faithful allies. And where you will keep going on. But for the next 3 years, as the British continued to concentrate their remaining forces in the vicinity of Long Island and New York City, Washington engaged in a holding operation in the Middle States. Even when it lost, the Continental Army of General George fought reasonably well and continued to improve. German officers observed in their journals that Washington's officers seemed to be well informed on European military literature. In America, senior officers like Henry Knox and Nathaniel Greene made references to the tactics of Caesar, Charles XII, Frederick the Great, and in light of this, perhaps the so-called Baron Friedrich von Steuben has received too much credit. But the former member of Frederick the Great's staff did standardize critical practices, including drill formation and moving in column and line, but he did so in what amounted to collaboration with Washington, who oversaw his writing and made improvements before publication of regulations for the discipline of the troops of the United States. But anyway, as a result of his experiences at Valley Forge, Washington spread his forces in a kind of arc around the enemy in New York, just as he had deployed them when containing Howe's army in Philadelphia in 1778. That way he could better control much of the countryside, support the Patriot militia, and harass the Loyalists. And because Washington had all he could handle in controlling the Continental Army in the Middle Department, he could not effectively supervise and instruct the American commanding generals in the New England, Northern, Western, and Southern departments. And thus far, except in the Northern Department where Gates bested Burgoyne, most of the action had taken place in Washington's theater. And in the West, small forces and their Indian allies had fought sporadically but furiously, with both sides committing gruesome atrocities. Owing to old grievances against colonial expansion, most Indians sided with the king rather than with the Continental Congress. Daniel Boone sought to defend Kentucky settlers from British and Indian raiders based in Detroit. George Rogers Clark of Virginia staged a campaign of retaliation into the Illinois country, seizing several of its places there, like Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. Although Spain entered the war on the side of France, occupying West Florida and parts of the lower Mississippi, neither side gained control of the vast interior. One decisive American victory came when General John Sullivan destroyed numerous Iroquois tribal villages in the New York backcountry. But permanent peace in the frontier awaited diplomatic events in Europe. The war took a new direction in the late year of 1778, after Britain reversed its policy of largely ignoring American South. In the year 1776, a small British military and naval expedition under Clinton and Commodore Sir Peter Parker had been ordered to stir Loyalist support along the coast of the Carolinas. Since the North Carolina Loyalists had prematurely taken up arms and suffered a total defeat at Moore's Creek in the month of February, Clinton and Parker sailed on to join the Armada for the assault on New York City. The Loyalists had hoped to establish a beachhead near Charleston, South Carolina, but in the month of June, the city's defenders drove off the attackers. This setback hardly dampened the enthusiasm of Loyalist leaders and exiled Southern royal governors. They assured Germain that the population from Virginia to Georgia was overwhelmingly committed to the crown, that the Loyalists had been intimidated by the Patriot minority, and that the appearance of a British army would bring them rallying to the king's standard. Again, Germain replaced General Howe. Regardless of how well-intentioned an occupying nation may be, rarely have a people enjoyed being occupied. But the South British forces had seemingly subdued Georgia, except for scattered resistance in the backcountry, and fighting was indecisive in Georgia, in the Georgia-South Carolina borderlands in 1779. South Carolina was a greater test and a greater prize because of its enormous wealth and sizable population. That challenge did not come until early 1780. Slow to implement fully the Southern strategy, Clinton finally brought the bulk of his army from New York to South Carolina and landed just below Charleston. He soon put the city under siege. Charleston's dignitaries insisted that General Benjamin Lincoln lay down his arms rather than see their beautiful metropolis destroyed. And on the 12th of May, Lincoln surrendered the state capital and about 5,500 men, the largest group of American forces taken anywhere during the war. Within 2 weeks, South Carolina appeared to be completely subdued. Many prominent Charlestonians, backcountry loyalists, and neutralists pledged allegiance to George III. Clinton paroled hundreds of militiamen captured at Charleston in return for their promise to remain neutral or to sit out of the war. Yet in just 2 months, Clinton and his subordinate Lord Charles Cornwallis alienated countless former patriots and even some long-standing loyalists. Loyalists complained that their Britain was slow to restore civilian control. The Clinton parolees, told that if called upon they must take up arms for Britain, felt that their pledge of neutrality had been violated. Even the defeat of a small force of Continentals and militia under General Gates on the 16th of August at Camden in the South Carolina backcountry did not dampen renewed resistance. Patriot guerrilla chieftains Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens took to the field in response to threats and mistreatment from marauding loyalists. On the 7th of October, at Kings Mountain, Patriot militia wiped out Major Patrick Ferguson's 1,000-man loyalist force, noted for its harsh treatment of former patriots. And so when Clinton returned to New York, he left Cornwallis in command of South Carolina with permission to advance into North Carolina and Virginia if the safety of Charleston and the tranquility of South Carolina was assured. With South Carolina's backcountry in revolt, Cornwallis marched north, justifying his offensive on the grounds that the Patriots were being supplied from North Carolina. And so next, we'll talk about the die and how the die is now cast. In our third section, considering the War for Independence in our American Revolution series.